Hi guys, this is my last lecture for you this year. We're in World War II, Chapter 36, and this is Section 2. We're going to be looking at mostly at the Cold War, but the finish of World War II. As part of their vision for Europe, the Nazis proposed a new racial order. They proclaimed that the Germanic people, or the Aryans, were a master race. Now, this was a misuse of the term Aryan. The term actually refers to the Indo-European peoples who began to migrate into the Indian subcontinent around 1500 BCE. The Nazis claimed that all non-Aryan peoples, particularly Jews, were inferior. This racist message would eventually lead to the Holocaust and the systematic mass slaughter of Jews and other groups judged to be inferior by the Nazis. To gain support for his racist ideas, Hitler knowingly tapped into a hatred for Jews that had deep roots in European history. For generations, many Germans, along with other Europeans, had targeted Jews as the cause of their failures. Some Germans even blamed the Jews for their country's defeat in World War I and for its economic problems after the war. In time, the Nazis made the targeting of Jews a government policy. The Nuremberg Laws passed in 1935 deprived Jews of their rights to German citizenship and forbade marriages between Jews and non-Jews. Laws passed later also limited the kinds of work that Jews could do for a living. Worse yet was to come. Early in November 1938, 17-year-old Herschel Grinspan, a Jewish youth from Germany, was visiting an uncle in Paris. While Grinspan was there, he received a postcard. It said that after living in Germany for 27 years, his father had been deported to Poland. On November 7th, wishing to avenge his father's deportation, Grinspan shot a German diplomat living in Paris. When Nazi leaders heard of the news, they launched a violent attack on the Jewish community. On November 9th, Nazi stormtroopers attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues across Germany and murdered close to 100 Jews. An American in Leipzig wrote, "Jewish window shops by the hundreds were systematically smashed. The main streets of the city were a positive litter of shattered plate glass." It is for this reason that the night of November 9th became known as Kristallnacht, or a night of broken glass. Kristallnacht marked a major step up in the Nazi policy of Jewish persecution. The future for Jews in Germany looked very grim. After Kristallnacht, some Jews realized that violence against them was bound to increase. By the end of 1939, a number of German Jews had fled to other countries. Many, however, remained in Germany. Later, Hitler conquered territories in which a million more Jews had fled to. At first, Hitler favored emigration as a solution to what he called the Jewish problem. Getting other countries to continue admitting German Jews became an issue, however. After admitting tens of thousands of Jewish refugees, such countries as France, Britain, and the U.S. abruptly closed their doors to further immigration. Germany's foreign minister observed, quote, "We all want to get rid of our Jews. The difficulty is that no country wishes to receive them." When Hitler found that he couldn't get rid of the Jews through emigration, he put another plan into effect. He ordered Jews in all countries under his control to be moved to designated cities. In those cities, the Nazis herded the Jews into dismal, overcrowded ghettos or segregated Jewish areas. The Nazis then sealed off the ghettos with barbed wire and stone walls. They hoped that the Jews inside would starve to death or die from disease. Hitler's war on the Jews turned toward the final solution in 1942. The Nazis built extermination camps equipped with huge gas chambers that could kill as many as 6,000 human beings in a day. When prisoners arrived at Auschwitz, the largest of the extermination camps, they paraded before a committee of SS doctors. With a wave of the hand, these doctors separated the strong, mostly men, from the weak, most women, young children, the elderly, and the sick. Those labeled as weak would die that day. They were told to undress for a shower and then led into a chamber with fake shower heads. After the doors were closed, cyanide gas or carbon dioxide poured from the shower heads or holes in the ceiling. All inside were killed in a matter of minutes. Later, the Nazis installed crematoriums or ovens to burn the bodies. Some 6 million Jews died in these death camps or in Nazi massacres. Fewer than 4 million survived. Some escaped the horrors of the death camps with help from non-Jewish people. These rescuers, at great risk to their own lives, hid Jews in their homes or helped them escape to the neutral countries. Those who survived the death camps were changed forever by what they had experienced. As Elie Wiesel, nearly 15 years old when he entered Auschwitz, noted, "Never shall I forget the little faces of the children, whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned all my dreams to dust. Never. Even under these horrible conditions, the Jews still hung on. Some, particularly the Jews in Warsaw, Poland, formed a resistance organization within the ghettos. They also struggled to keep their traditions. Ghetto theaters produced plays and concerts. Teachers taught lessons in secret schools. Scholars kept records so that one day people would find out the real truth of what happened. Women played a major role in World War II. Many women volunteered as WAVs. These were women appointed for volunteer service in the Navy. In the United States and Great Britain, women were barred from serving in combat units, but they did serve at the front as nurses. Soviet and Chinese forces included women fighters. Women were very active in the resistance movements, especially in Poland and in France. And women occupied jobs that when the men were away at the war that they had to do. They also took on the head of household duties. Temporarily, men returned from the war and displaced women. Yet, World War II would prove to be a lasting impact on the women's movement because many women refused to return home. They liked the idea of being able to go out and go to work every single day. So this began actually the women's movement after World War II. The war was not even over yet in February of 1945, but the leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union met at the Soviet Black Sea resort of Yalta. There they agreed to divide Germany into zones of occupation controlled by the Allied military forces. Germany also would have to pay the Soviet Union to compensate for its loss of life and property. Stalin agreed to join the war against Japan. He also promised that Eastern Europeans would have free elections. A skeptical Winston Churchill predicted that Stalin would not keep his pledge, but only keep it if the Eastern European countries followed a policy friendly to Russia, meaning that they became a communist country. Meanwhile, the United States and Soviet relations continued to worsen in 1946 and 1947 after World War II. An increasingly worried U.S. tried to offset the growing Soviet threat to Eastern Europe. President Truman adopted a foreign policy called containment. It was a policy directed at blocking Soviet influence and stopping the expansion of communism. Containment policies included forming alliances and helping weak countries resist the Soviet advances. Truman's support for countries that rejected communism was called the Truman Doctrine. It caused great controversy. Some opponents objected to American interference in other nations' affairs. Others argued that the U.S. could not afford to carry on global crusade against communism. Congress, however, immediately authorized more than $400 million in aid to Turkey and Greece. After World War II, much of Western Europe lay in ruins. There was also economic turmoil, scarcity of jobs and food. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall proposed that the U.S. give aid to needy European countries. This assistance program, called the Marshall Plan, would provide food, machinery, and other materials to rebuild Western Europe. As Congress debated the $12.5 billion program in 1948, the communists seized power in Czechoslovakia. Congress immediately voted approval. The plan was a spectacular success. Even communist Yugoslavia received aid after it broke away from the Soviet domination. While Europe began rebuilding, the United States and its allies clashed with the Soviet Union over Germany. The Soviets wanted to keep their former enemy weak and divided. But in 1948, France, Britain, and the U.S. decided to withdraw their forces from Germany and allow their occupation zones to form one nation. The Soviet Union responded by holding West Berlin hostage. Although Berlin lay well within the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, it too had been divided into 4 zones. The Soviet Union cut off highway, water, and rail traffic to Berlin's western zones. The city faced starvation. Stalin gambled that the Allies would surrender West Berlin or give up their idea of reunifying Germany. But Americans and British officials flew food and supplies into West Berlin for nearly 11 months. In May 1949, the Soviet Union admitted defeat and lifted the blockade. Conflicts between the United States and the Soviet Union divided the world and marked the start of the Cold War. A Cold War is a struggle over political differences carried on by means short of military action or war. Beginning in 1945, the superpowers used spying, propaganda, diplomacy, secret operations in their dealings with each other. Much of the world allied with one side or the other. In fact, Until the Soviet Union finally broke up in 1991, the Cold War dictated not only U.S. and Soviet foreign policy, but influenced world alliances as well. The Berlin blockade heightened Western Europe's fear of Soviet aggression. As a result, in 1949, 10 Western European countries joined with the United States and Canada to form a defensive military alliance. It was called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. An attack on any NATO member would be met with armed forces by all member nations. The Soviet Union saw NATO as a threat and formed its own alliance in 1955. It was called the Warsaw Pact and included the Soviet Union, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albania. In 1961, the East Germans built a wall to separate East and West Berlin. The Berlin Wall symbolized a world divided in rival camps. However, not every country joined the new alliance. Some, like India, chose not to align with either side. In China, the largest communist country, came to distrust the Soviet Union, and it remained non-aligned. Under their leader, Mao Zedong, the communists had a stronghold in northwestern China. From there, they mobilized peasants for guerrilla war against the Japanese in the northeast. Thanks to their efforts to promote literacy and improve food production, the communists won the peasants' loyalty. By 1945, they controlled much of northern China. Meanwhile, the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek dominated southwestern China. Protected by the Japanese by rugged mountain ranges, Chiang gathered an army of 2.5 million men. From 1942 to 1945, the U.S. sent nationalists at least 1.5 billion in aid to fight the Japanese. Instead of benefiting the army, however, these supplies and money often ended up in the hands of a few corrupt officers. Chiang's army actually fought few battles against the Japanese. Instead, the nationalist army saved its strength for the coming battle against Mao's Red Army. After Japan surrendered, the nationalists and the communists resumed fighting each other. The renewed civil war lasted from 1946 to 1949. At first, the nationalists had the advantage. Their armies outnumbered the communists by as much as 3 to 1, and the nationalist forces, however, did not win the popular support. With China's economy collapsing, thousands of nationalist soldiers deserted to the communists. In spring 1949, China's major cities fell to Mao's forces. Mao's troops were also very enthusiastic about his promise to return land to the peasants. The remnant of Chiang's shattered army fled south. In October 1949, Mao Zedong gained control of the country. He proclaimed it to be the People's Republic of China. Chiang and other nationalist leaders fled to the island of Taiwan, which Westerners called Formosa at the time. After Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, the U.S. helped him set up a nationalist government on that small island. It was called the Republic of China. The Soviets gave financial, military, and technical aid to Communist China. In addition, the Chinese and the Soviets pledged to come to each other's defense if either was attacked. The U.S. tried to halt Soviet expansion in Asia. When the Soviets forces occupied the northern half of Korea after World War II and set up a communist government, the U.S. supported a separate democratic state in the south. By 1949, both the U.S. and the Soviet Union had withdrawn most of their troops from Korea. Meanwhile, the Soviets supplied North Korea with tanks, airplanes, and money in an attempt to take over the Korean peninsula. On June 25, 1950, North Koreans swept across the 38th parallel in a surprise attack on South Korea. Within days, North Korean troops had penetrated deep into the south. President Truman was convinced that the North Korean aggressors were repeating what Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese had done in the 1930s. Truman's policy of containment was being put to the test, and Truman resolved to help South Korea resist communism. South Korea also asked the United Nations to intervene. When the matter came to a vote in the Security Council, the Soviets were absent. They had refused to take part in a council to protest admission of nationalist China, Taiwan, rather than the communist China. In the United Nations, as a result, the Soviet Union could not veto the UN's plan to send an international force to Korea to stop the invasion. A total of 15 nations, including the U.S. and Britain, participated under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. Meanwhile, the North Koreans continued to advance. By September of 1950, they controlled the entire Korean peninsula except for a tiny area around Busan in the far southeast. That month, however, MacArthur launched a surprise attack. Troops moving north from Busan met with forces that had made an amphibious landing at Incheon. Caught in the pincer action, about half of the North Koreans surrendered. The rest retreated. The UN troops pursued the retreating North Koreans across the 38th parallel into North Korea. They pushed them almost to the Yalu River at the Chinese border. The UN forces were mostly from the U.S. The Chinese felt threatened by these troops and an American fleet off their coast. In October of 1950, they sent 300,000 troops into North Korea. The Chinese greatly outnumbered the UN forces. By January of 1951, they had pushed UN and South Korean troops out of North Korea. The Chinese then moved into South Korea and captured the capital of Seoul. MacArthur called for a nuclear attack on China. Truman viewed MacArthur's proposal as reckless. After all, they were trying to prevent a war, not have a full-scale war. MacArthur tried to go over the president's head by taking his case to Congress and the press. In response, Truman removed him. Over the next 2 years, UN forces fought to drive the Chinese and North Koreans back. In 1952, UN troops had regained control of South Korea. Finally, in July of 1953, the UN forces and North Korea signed a ceasefire agreement. The border between the two Koreas was set near the 38th parallel, almost where it had been before the war. In the meantime, 4 million soldiers and civilians had died. In the early 1900s, France controlled most of Southeast Asia. It was called French Indochina, but nationalist independent movements had begun to develop. A young Vietnamese nationalist named Ho Chi Minh turned to the communists for help in his struggle. During the 1930s, Indochinese Communist Party led revolts and strikes against the French. The French responded by jailing Vietnamese protesters. They also sentenced Ho Chi Minh to death. He fled into exile but returned to Vietnam in 1941, a year after the Japanese seized control of his country during World War II. Ho Chi Minh and other nationalists founded the Vietnamese League. The Japanese were forced out of Vietnam after their defeat in 1945. Now, Ho Chi Minh believed that independence would follow, but France intended to retain its colonies. Vietnamese nationalists and communists actually joined together to fight the French armies. The French held most major cities, but the Viet Minh had the widespread support in the countryside. The Viet Minh used guerrilla tactics to confine the French to their cities, and in France, the people began to doubt that their colony was worth the lives and the money and the struggle that it cost. In 1954, the French suffered a major military defeat in Dien Bien Phu. They surrendered to Ho. The United States had supported France in Vietnam. With the defeat of the French, the U.S. saw a rising threat to the rest of Asia. President Eisenhower described this threat in terms of the domino theory. The Southeast Asian nations were like a row of dominoes, he said. The fall of one to communism would lead to the fall of its neighbors. This theory became a major justification for U.S. foreign policy during the Cold War era. While many satellite countries resisted communist rule, China was committed to communism. In fact, to cement ties between communist powers, Mao and Stalin had signed a 30-year treaty of friendship in 1950. Their spirit of cooperation, however, ran out before the treaty did. The Soviets assumed that the Chinese would follow the Soviet leadership in world affairs. As the Chinese grew more confident, however, they resented being in Moscow's shadow. They began to spread their own brand of communism in Africa and other parts of Asia. In 1959, Khrushchev punished the Chinese by refusing to share nuclear secrets. The following year, the Soviets ended technical economic aid to China. The Soviet-Chinese split grew so wide that fighting actually broke out along their common border. After repeated incidents, the two neighbors maintained a fragile peace. In the 1950s, Cuba was ruled by an unpopular dictator named Fulgencio Batista, who had U.S. support. Cuban resentment led to a popular revolution which overthrew Batista in January of 1959. A young lawyer named Fidel Castro led that revolution. And at first, many people praised Castro for bringing social reforms to Cuba and improving the economy. Yet Castro was a harsh dictator. He suspended elections, he jailed or executed his opponents, and tightly controlled the press. When Castro nationalized the Cuban economy, he took over U.S.-owned sugar mills and refineries and oil wells. In response, Eisenhower ordered an embargo, or a quarantine, on all trade with Cuba. Castro then turned to the Soviets for economic and military aid. In 1960, the CIA began to train anti-Castro Cuban exiles. In April of 1961, they invaded Cuba, landing at the Bay of Pigs. However, the U.S. did not provide the hoped-for air support. Castro's forces easily defeated the invaders, humiliating the United States. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion convinced Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev that the U.S. would not resist Soviet expansion in Latin America. So in July 1962, Khrushchev secretly began to build 42 missile sites in Cuba. In October, an American spy plane discovered the sites. President John F. Kennedy declared that missiles so close to the U.S. mainland were a threat. He demanded their removal and also announced a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent the Soviets from installing more missiles. Remember, there can be a blockade, or they can call it an embargo or a quarantine, okay? So Castro protested his country being used as a pawn in the Cold War, but in reality, Castro and Cuba were deeply involved. Kennedy's demand for the removal of Soviet missiles put the U.S. and the Soviet Union on a collision course, though. People around the world feared a nuclear war. Fortunately, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in return for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. The resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis left Castro completely dependent on the Soviet Union for support. In exchange for the support, Castro backed communist revolutions in Latin America and Africa. Soviet aid to Cuba ended abruptly with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, and this loss dealt a crippling blow to the Cuban economy. Eventually, Castro loosened state control of Cuba's economy and sought better relations with other countries and became more capitalist. Back in the Soviet Union, after Stalin died in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became the dominant Soviet leader. In 1956, the shrewd, tough Khrushchev denounced Stalin for jailing and killing loyal Soviet citizens. His speech signaled the start of a policy called de-Stalinization, or purging the country of Stalin's memory. Workers actually went out and destroyed monuments of the former dictator, and Khrushchev called for peaceful competition with capitalist states. But this new Soviet outlook didn't change life in their satellite countries. Their resentment at times turned to active protest. In October 1956, the Hungarian army joined protesters to overthrow Hungary's Soviet-controlled government. Storming through the capital of Budapest, mobs waved Hungarian flags with the communist hammer and sickle emblem cut out. No Hungarian citizen wanted communism at that time. A popular and liberal Hungarian communist leader named Imre Nagy formed a new government. Nagy promised free elections and demanded Soviet troops leave Hungary. In response, Soviet tanks and infantry entered Budapest in November. Thousands of Hungarian freedom fighters armed themselves with pistols and bottles, but were completely overwhelmed by the superior forces of the Soviet Union. A pro-Soviet government was then installed, and Nagy was executed. Leonid Brezhnev replaced Khrushchev when party leaders voted to remove him from power. Brezhnev made it clear that he would not tolerate dissent in Eastern Europe. His policy was put to the test early in 1968. At that time, Czech communist leader Alexander Dubček loosened control on censorship to offer his country, quote, socialism with a human face. This period of reform, when Czechoslovakia's capital city, Prague, bloomed with new ideas, became known as the Prague Spring. However, it did not survive the summer. On August 20th, armed forces from the Warsaw Pact nations invaded Czechoslovakia. Brezhnev justified this invasion by claiming the Soviet Union had the right to prevent its satellites from rejecting communism, a policy known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. The brinkmanship policies followed during the presidencies of Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson led to one terrifying crisis after another. Though these crises erupted all over the world, they were united by a common fear. Nuclear war seemed possible. Widespread popular protests racked the U.S. during the Vietnam War, and the turmoil didn't end with the U.S. withdrawal. As it tried to heal its internal wounds, the U.S. backed away from a policy of direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. Détente, a policy of lessening the Cold War tensions, replaced brinkmanship under Richard Nixon. President Nixon's move toward détente grew out of a philosophy known as realpolitik. This term comes from the German word meaning realistic politics. In practice, realpolitik meant dealing with other nations in a practical and flexible manner. While the U.S. continued to try to contain the spread of communism, the two superpowers agreed to pursue détente and to reduce tensions. Nixon's new policy represented a personal reversal as well as a political shift for his country. His rise in politics in the 1950s was largely due to his strong anti-communist position. 20 years later, he became the first U.S. president to visit communist China. The visit made sense in a world in which three, not just two superpowers, eyed each other suspiciously. 3 months after visiting Beijing in February of 1972, Nixon visited the Soviet Union. After a series of meetings called the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT, Nixon and Brezhnev actually signed the SALT I Treaty. This 5-year agreement limited to 1972 levels the number of intercontinental ballistic and submarine launched missiles each country could have. In 1975, 33 nations joined the U.S. and the Soviet Union in signing commitment to détente and cooperation, and this was called the Helsinki Accords.